My name is Mike Martin. I'm the Honorary Lieutenant Colonel of the 33 Signal Regiment here in Ottawa, and the previous owners and holders of the Tew sword. Col.Tew was the first valedictorian of the Citadel Military Academy. He was first in his class when he graduated. He went on to establish the Arsenal Military Academy, which was a feeder school in Columbus, North Carolina, which is now the residence of the Governor of North Carolina. Col.Tew became a leading figure in the Civil War. The firing on Fort Sumter was actually carried out by cadets of the Citadel Military Academy. And that was, as we know, the outset of the war. Tew went on to a career serving in the armies of Virginia. He was the person who designed the coastal defenses of the Confederacy up and down the Atlantic coast. He went on to many major battles, and he ultimately met his fate at the Battle of Sharpsville from the Confederate side. The North terms it as Antietam. At the battle, on the first day, he was in the right of the line, commanding the right of the line. General Leonard was in the far left of the line, and there was another colonel in the center. The colonel in the center was killed, and Tew moved to the center of the line to take control of the center of the line, at which point General Leonard was shot in the leg, and he was withdrawn from the battle. And he signaled to Tew that he was to be in charge of the battle. Tew was outside of earshot, so they sent a runner. He was in what's known as the sunken road at Antietam. And if you're at all familiar with the battlefield, it's actually a depressed road, and the Union forces were coming from a height of about 50 feet above that on a down slope. So he was firing up. When the runner got to the center of the line, he called to Tew to let him know that he was now in charge of the battle, at which point Tew tipped his hat to the runner to acknowledge it, whereupon he was shot through the temple, blinding him and mortally wounding him, and he fell to the ground. He was pulled back into the sunken road, and according to the photos that exist, he was positioned against the wall of the sunken road. After the battle had passed, the Union troops were looking for booty, I guess, after battle booty, and they happened upon Colonel Tew. And he had in his possession 3 articles. He had his sword, he had a silver cup, and he had a watch. All 3 articles were taken, but the story about the sword is that when the Union captain reached down to take the sword, even though Tew was blind and he was dying, he held onto the sword and he pulled it up to his chest. And he held it at his chest until he expired, at which time the sword was taken. In that party, there's an odd Canadian connection. There's a Captain Reed who was purportedly part of that party. And his backstory is a little interesting in that he comes across as a bit of a Jack Sparrow type of character, an adventurer, a freebooter, and he has a connection with the removal of the sword.
You stole my boat.
Actually, borrowed without permission.
The sword and the other articles disappear from the battlefield. The family, in the period following the end of the Civil War, they're getting messages that they believe Tew is alive. The father travels down to Florida, where there's a hospital and a prison, and Tew's not there for obvious reasons. The sword materializes at a Oddfellows Lodge up in Seneca County. About 1872, it's noted as hanging on a wall there. Time moves on, the sword disappears from that spot. We fast forward to 1963, and there's a lady by the name of Elizabeth Blythe Souder who has possession of the sword. She's the last of her line. She lives in Utica, New York, but she has a third cousin who is a descendant of the Tew family, and he happens to be the CEO of the number 3 Signal Squadron, predecessor to 33 Signals here in Ottawa. So she brings his collection of swords up and gives them to the cousin, and unfortunately I don't have his name. The CO then gifts them to the regiment. And they're used, they're hung up on the wall, they're hung up in the mess. This was at Wallace House. And they're used for different ceremonial things, knocking the tops off champagne bottles at New Year's and other things that they would do within the mess. And it was ultimately affixed to the wall with a screw and a mounting at Wallace House. I guess it was around 2010 that Wallace House was going to be shut down, and they sent all of the regimental articles to a memorabilia, a militaria appraiser to make sure everything was properly insured, that it could be moved on and stored at the new Holland Armory on Walkley Street. The assessor, when he came to the Tew sword, had a stop moment. He advised that the sword was in fact a piece of true military historia, that it had a tremendous value that would not lend itself to be insured by the regiment. And as it wasn't Canadian military historical property, it was of a different nation and different war, it wasn't subject to the coverage of insurance that they could get through the government. So it was left in the vault. And then in 2010, I got involved with the Regimental Foundation, and there was a lot of discussion surrounding the sword and what should be done with it, that it should be returned to its rightful owners. We had to prove the provenance of it, because as we started to get into it, we discovered there were websites dedicated to searching for this sword and the other artifacts. There was a lot of activity in the US. This was a sought-after item. However, proving the provenance of the sword proved to be a challenge. There were existing photos of paintings of Tew holding the sword. On the sword itself, there is a plaque that shows up in the paintings, where it states that the sword is presented to Captain Col.Tew by the students of the Arsenal Academy in recognition of his departure. He was on his way to Europe to study military arts with the European powers. So we could identify that plaque. There is a position of the colonel holding the sword that could not be replicated. The orientation of the sword, it wasn't, we couldn't do it. So that was problematic for us compared to the oil paintings. So while we were doing that, I did reach out to the Citadel and advise them that we thought we had their sword. And it was a Whiskey Tango Foxtrot moment for them. They were really surprised, and that started the wheels in motion. I was dealing with a Lieutenant Colonel Goebel from the library. He was the librarian for the Citadel, and we started exchanging information, trying to really establish provenance. It got to the point where we're now the January, February of 2015, and up pops Tew's great, 5th generation granddaughter. And she explains to us the reason we can't orient the sword is that the painting is taken from the wrong side of a de gravure plate, predecessor to a negative. So the image is in inverse. So once we understood that, we then could prove the provenance. It was decided to gift it to the university as opposed to returning it to a family member, because that was the focal point of his career, and that's where it originated. So we wanted to return it from whence it came. The university was very accommodating in working with us to set up a handover at the university. We worked with the U.S. National Park Service to schedule on the eve of the battle a presentation for that. We were supported by members of the regiment and Brigadier General Robert Maslin, who was the senior serving Canadian in the area. He was second in command of an element of the NSA down in Washington. He came and acted as a senior officer on site in the presentation. One of the difficulties in crossing the border with an item like that, it can be deemed to be a treasure of the U.S. government, and it's eligible to be seized at the border by U.S. Customs. So that brought another wrinkle into the fabric of doing this. We worked with members of the U.S. Embassy here in town. They brought in the senior folks from U.S. Customs, and they expedited the passages of the sword through the border. It was quite remarkable because while we were driving down, we had a little convoy, and while we were driving down, we were getting calls from the border, how close are you, how close are you? And we arrive at the border, this is at Ogdensburg, and they had a tremendous welcoming committee. Every senior customs official from basically Albany, New York to Ottawa was at the border to greet the sword. They had their internal magazine for U.S. Customs was there to take pictures. They shut the border down for about 40 minutes while we did this pass through and everybody got their photos taken with it. It was really quite nice to see. We proceeded from there down to Antietam. And the next morning, the U.S. Park Service had put on a repatriation ceremony. We were met by an honor guard from the Citadel and senior members of the U.S. Park Service.
I now pass the sword to the cadets of the Citadel from whence it came.
I accept the sword on behalf of the Citadel and the South Carolina Corps Cadets.
It was quite a touching ceremony. The Park Service explained what happened during the battle. And one very poignant moment that shocked everybody was at the wreath-laying ceremony. The regiment laid a wreath in honor of Col.Tew. The Citadel with Lieutenant Colonel Goebel, their color party came up, they laid a wreath, and as Colonel Goebel steps back to take the salute, all of the flowers fall from their wreath to the spot on the ground where Col.Tew had died. And you can hear the murmur go through the crowd on the video. It was really, it caught everybody off guard. So that was quite something. From there, we proceeded onward to the Citadel. And at the Citadel, it was basically 2.5 days of different ceremonies. They had a lovely reception in the library. They welcomed us. The members of the regiment were invited onto their parade field to do the handover. And then I guess the finale was all 2,500 cadets of the Citadel were paraded onto the field to receive the sword. So it was a very big deal in the Citadel, in their history, and it was covered extensively by media in the southeastern U.S. So North and South Carolina onto Florida, over into the Virginias and such. So I will tell you that the members of our regiment really did us all very proud on that day. The ceremony was very moving, the drill was very sharp, and the sword now resides at the library at the Citadel in a case with a plaque that shows that it was gifted in perpetuity to the Citadel by the 33 Signal Regiment of the Royal Canadian Corps of Signals.